you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But to your point, the creativity, I think, is that's where you unlock value, because sometimes the greatest experience don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. A lot of times it's just thinking differently and doing things differently. And the fact that there are so many events and a lot of them are very similar in nature, even if they're in different industries, like you have the happy hour sponsor, you have the title sponsor. It's just like it's very similar in what they're able to offer in terms of the value prop. So the more creative you can get, the more responsive or receptive potential sponsors will be, because they want to do things differently. And, ROI is calculated in a lot of different ways. And depending on what their goals are, that can help drive some of the decision making in terms of what do we want to offer them and how much ultimately does it cost us.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super excited to have Danny Meyer on the show today, who helps us look at the industry from a different lens, which is more the finance lens. You're the VP and Corporate Controller at Access Intelligence, or at least that's what your LinkedIn profile says. And Access Intelligence is an interesting publication and events company, and has actually grown through M&A as well. So I'd love to have you start out with sort of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. How have the brands in your portfolio had to adapt, and how do you think the industry has adapted to sort of the new normal with regards to events?
It's a great question. I mean, before the pandemic, it was amazing the effort that it took to get communities together. And there was quite a bit of planning. And in some cases, the lead time from when commitments would come in, whether you're talking about exhibitors, sponsors, speakers, building out the program. And it was a much longer lead time. And when everything shut down, there was a pivot to virtual, and we were, the beneficiary of having the infrastructure and capabilities to run many of our events on a virtual digital platform. And, it didn't quite replace the in-person experience, but during that time where that wasn't an option, it was a way to keep the lights on and also keep the community engaged, which was critical, because we knew that it was going to be temporary and we wanted to be well positioned for when things did open back up. And in terms of the major difference now versus then, I would say relates to that planning and how much lead time there is. Whereas, the half-life for an event in terms of the registration for attendees used to be 30 days or 45 days out from the event. Now is less than a month. And I think folks just realize that even though there might be some pricing differences and deadlines, they're willing to wait until closer to the date just to make sure they can actually make it. And, with so many surprises and things that happened, whether it was, lockdowns or people not being well or budgetary restraints, there was the reality of people weren't able to plan as far out in advance. And a lot of times on the programming side, and that was a challenge in terms of having your agenda built out, but also having backups and the ability to keep the operation going if there was going to be a change to the speaker lineup or the agenda, even just a few days out from the event. And much more so now than before the pandemic. And the responsiveness from attendees in terms of their willingness or their acknowledging difference in price, they seem less receptive to those pricing changes and deadlines. They're willing to possibly pay a little more of a premium to have that flexibility and not book until closer to the deadline. And in terms of our planning, before the pandemic, there was a lot more in terms of details we can go through with venues and how far out in terms of how many years in advance we needed to book space and understanding the minimums and, managing our level of commitments. It was all a planning function. You're trying to determine how many people will be in the room, how many people you got to sit for lunch, the style and nature of the different experiences at the event. And we were dealing with many venues and contracts that, it was difficult to unwind, or we had committed to something based on the pre-pandemic levels that, had since changed, and we were forced to operate within minimums that didn't necessarily fit the current business model. And so similar to how the attendee has responded to that dynamic, I think event planners have done the same. It's always a competition for dates and for locations. You know, you want to own a city, you want to own a time or spot on the calendar, but at the same time, you don't want to overcommit or plan for something that's so far out that it's difficult to actually accurately forecast what the expectations are for that event. And so, in the dynamic and the balancing act between getting the best venues and dates, but not overcommitting to size and space and F&B specifically, because that's really what happened is when you were forced to carry out an event on old paper, so to speak, you know, you couldn't hit those minimums based on attendees or the size of the event post-pandemic or attritions. You know, you're not filling room blocks, and so you're forced to bear those additional costs, which at the time made sense. There was no way to know. And you know, it's amazing from an insurance perspective. Like there's event cancellation insurance, there's insurance for everything, but most of the time it's not covered. And so for us, even though a lot of events did get canceled, we weren't able to, you know, benefit from the insurance we had in place because it was a separate, you know, viral pandemic rider that we needed to buy up on, which no one ever thought would be relevant. And you thought it would all get captured under the force majeure, but that wasn't exactly the case. And so understanding the fine print and exactly what was covered in event cancellation insurance, I think that was another thing that came to light, because we were hoping that there would be benefit for some of those plans that we had committed to, but then after the cancellations happened, we found out that it actually didn't fall under what was covered.
Wow.
So that changed the planning when looking forward. Exactly what levels of coverage do you need, and what specific types of specialty coverage are realistic, and what's worth it? Because everything's a cost benefit analysis, and so you know, depending on the size and scope of the event, exactly how much insurance do you need, and what does it exactly need to cover? So I'd say the biggest changes pre and post is around the ability to plan and how far out in advance, and how much we're willing to commit to in terms of whether you're talking about venue space, food and beverage minimums, insurance coverages. I think there was just more of an awareness of how much can change in just a couple of years' time, and how to protect the business in such a way so that you're not left exposed.
Yeah, it sounds like in a word, be more nimble. So
Exactly.
the now obviously events are a two-sided marketplace, right? Especially when they're exhibitors or sponsors. Where do you feel like the budget's freed up first? Was it from the exhibitors sort of saying, okay, or sponsors saying, okay, we're ready to go back into events? Or was it the attendees having T&E budget that they're able to attend the events? Because you sort of need them to come back at about the same pace. But is one lagging
Right.
the other? Is sort of, did the money show up first in the sponsor side, or did it show up first in the T&E budgets for the attendees?
I would say it definitely showed up in the exhibitor and sponsor side first,
I see.
because for them, they had products, and they needed to get to the marketplace. They needed to get in front of their customers, and they had built up that pent up demand, if you will. And so they
Right.
were forced to operate within selective channels during the pandemic. And then once the opportunity to, you know, be on stage or present and or be at on an expo floor, and actually have their products there and their sales team on site, there was an appetite there, and that I think turned around first. And not that attendees didn't want to come. I think it was more just the levels of the attendee and the ability for that attendee to make that registration further in advance. And so, as I mentioned before, like the half-life came much closer to the event date than it had been historically. But from a sponsor and exhibitor standpoint, you could tell they had the appetite to get back out there and do the road shows. And so, and for us, it's kind of the cart before the horse. You know, if we build a program and you have the right sponsors and exhibitors first, that helps drive the attendee and helps drive some of the smaller players in terms of additional sponsors and exhibitors. So, you know, once we were able to get those commitments from the bigger names, that really opened up the floodgates in terms of generating interest from the rest of the ecosystem. Because to your point, you can't have one without the other. It's all
Right.
about bringing together the entire community. So you need that full level of buy-in and engagement, or else the value proposition changes. And so I think what came first was definitely the exhibit and sponsor. And also, I think the reality you mentioned on the T&E budget side, I think coming out of the pandemic, there has been a lot of budgetary restraints. And whether you call it zero-based budgeting and everybody wanting to know ROI for every single thing you've spent, you know, there was a lot more of a conscious effort to where are we going to put those resources, where are they best used, and a reluctance to just sort of throw chips across the table. So for the attendee, I think it became more of a, well, what was your travel budget last year? Or this is what it is this year. It became, well, why do we need to go to this event versus that event? And so I think on the attendee side, what you started to see was there was the leadership angle, which events were the leaders in those particular industries. And a lot of times attendees had to be more selective. And so they would pick those blue chip events. And so I think it was more of a challenge for smaller event planners and smaller events to capture that attendee spend because they were being much more selective. Whereas on the exhibit and sponsor side, they have to get their message out. They have to get in front of customers. And so it was a lot easier to get that justification and buy-in from finance when they're doing their budget and planning. So yeah, that came back first for sure.
Yeah, it's so funny. It reminds me of the challenge that a mall faces, the old
Yeah.
physical mall, right? They needed an anchor store, a Macy's or something like that to be the anchor of the shopping center. And then once they had that, they could go out and start to fill in the rest of the space. And it sounds like the event business is very similar. You need a couple of anchor sponsors who really want to reach that audience, and then you can sort of build out on top of that.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's about who's going to be there is the first question. And you want that name recognition. And once you start seeing your competitor's name show up, then you feel like I have to be there. And so you want to help control that narrative and be there to have a presence. And so that's absolutely right. Once you get one, then the rest of the dominoes start to fall.
Yeah. The other thing that, looking into the event space, having acquired the e-marketing association, basically, having been fallow for a couple of years, and that's a story for a different day. I started to look into the event space pretty carefully, and it seems like the vast majority of events and event companies also have either a strong publishing arm or they're part of an association that has sort of a big membership base. And, occasionally there are these sort of unicorns that are out there by themselves that are just in the events business. But I'd love to hear from you how the dynamic works between, having a publishing asset, which often has editors who can sort of moderate and put together panels and have their own gravitas within the industry versus a situation where you don't have that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it really is based on the ecosystem of that particular industry. And if there's a community, what we would say the whole entire supply chain, if you're looking to connect all the players, it's challenging when you don't have a media arm or a publishing arm because how do you keep in contact? How do you keep that audience engaged if you only have a couple of events a year? And so what the publishing and media side bring is the ability to have that 24/7 touch point where you're constantly communicating, getting feedback, and sort of building the brand outside of the in-person experience. But that's different from certain events where it's more of a buyer-seller type model where you're connecting buyers and sellers in a specific space where there's not necessarily the content piece that is as applicable. They're not there for the thought leadership or to learn. They're there to find buyers or they're there to find folks that they have budget that they need to get used. And so I think it really depends on the coverage area and exactly the industry that it touches on. Because when you think about, let's say, ad tech and martech and what's happening with connected TV and AI, obviously, there's all these changing technologies that impact the day to day for everybody involved in that supply chain, whether they're a buyer, whether they're an advertiser or a media agency. And so to understand those types of dynamics, it's a lot more of who's on stage, who's speaking, and getting access to that level of information and specific individuals. And so I think it's in those industries where having the publication and having the journalistic aspect, the 24/7 touch point, that's really where you need that because you need to be identified as an expert in the space. And not just an expert in the space, but that you have relationships with the key players in that industry. And I think when you talk about the difference between one event type versus the other, it's really about access to individuals, right? It's one thing to get a company to participate in an event, but there's a lot of different levels of which leaders from those companies you're going to get on stage and ultimately what they're allowed to say. And in other industries, that's not necessarily what the goal is. They're there to meet specific companies and they have an agenda that revolves more around the transactional aspect of it. And so that's the more traditional exhibit expo style event where that can happen however many times a year. It doesn't necessarily need a publication to be associated with it, where there's editors reaching out and building news stories. Plus, now with the fact that information and content is really everywhere, and some of it auto-generated from AI, how do you distinguish the value of the editor versus the aggregator of existing news?
Mm.
So I think the difference, in my opinion, is access, right? It's access to specific individuals, high level in organizations. So you're getting information that is relevant and pertinent to that audience, and you're getting it first, and they're able to use that information and present it in such a way that's much more useful to the end reader. And so when you think about the full ecosystem, what is the value proposition? Are the individuals there to learn something? Or are they there to meet people? Or are they there to transact and do business? And so depending on how you answer those questions is the type of event business you would want to build. And so, for an industry where there's constantly changing technology and things that impact their day to day, the individuals that show up could be operators. They could be people that are actually the doers and on the front line, so to speak. Whereas in other cases, it's more high level, more thought leadership, and it's more wide ranging in terms of what they're looking to learn at an event. Whereas if you're looking at a trade style expo, they're just looking to transact business. They're looking to find the right buyers and the right sellers, and the opportunity is getting them in the same place at the same time. The content not as important.
Right, right. One thing that, and maybe you know when it seemed to have accelerated, because it didn't occur to me until more recently that a lot of the sort of top 5 to 10% of players in a particular category decided that they needed their own event, right? Whether it's Salesforce or HubSpot or LiveRamp, or, like it's Adobe. I think they're having their summit this week or next week, right? I mean, a lot of these folks, and now was that because they felt like they couldn't achieve their marketing objectives participating in other events, or did they just say, I want to fully control the narrative?
I
I
would
don't
say
want the
that's the
competitors
answer.
here.
It's the control aspect, yeah, whereas they get to control the narrative. They're the one defining who's in, who's out, and what they're going to cover. And not that it's all a sales pitch, but they have the ability to fine tune and deliver it in such a way that they don't necessarily have to worry about who else is on stage and having their competitors in the room. And so I think there is a benefit to having your own event, but you're not going to get the same value as you will in an independent standalone event that brings together all of the players in the system. If you're there and you're at a Dreamforce or you're at a Google I/O event, you're only seeing one perspective. You're only getting, they're not going to want to talk about all the things that their competitors are doing right. And they're
Yeah,
not going to want to be realistic about things that they should do better or challenges that they've had. And so that ability to control the narrative, they obviously have the budgets, so they can do that, but that's not the best value for the end user or the participant, because for them, if you're an attendee at that type of event, you want to see the whole story. You want to know what they're doing differently from their competitors, and you want some people to get called out. And part of that, when you talk about the editorial arm and the journalistic aspect of the event, that is where it gets exciting, when you have someone like a Google on stage and someone is willing to ask them a tough question and
right.
they're on the spot and they have to answer it. And you're not going to get that at one of their events where everything is just very selected, pre-screened, approved by legal type thing. And so it's always nice to put them in an environment where they have to stand with their peers and competitors and face tough questions. And I think for the audience, that's what they want to see. They want to see, not necessarily them put in a tough spot, but they want to have every perspective in that conversation, not just the sole view from the host who's running the show, who's the biggest player in the space. Because then you're not learning as much as you will when they're standing there with their peers and they're forced to answer those questions.
Right, right. I'd love to dig a little bit more into the sort of different categories, right? You've got the trade show, which is really trade show floor, lots of booths, the networking and selling that occurs on the floor. Then you've got conferences, which may or may not have sort of a trade show floor. But if they do, then you've got this sort of inherent tension, because if people are there for the content,
Where's the
they
traffic?
may not go to the trade show floor in the same volume, right? And then you've got these other things like summits and masterminds that I don't think people have even a really good definition of sort of, well, what
What's
do I
one
get
versus
at
the
a
other?
summit? Like, how is that different from a conference? So
Yeah,
as
summit versus a boot camp versus a workshop versus a
exactly,
conference.
yeah. So I mean, there's these nuances that I don't even think, you know, are that easy to define from a marketing perspective. And obviously, when you're acquiring companies that sometimes have previously called it a summit or whatever, and you get the opportunity to maybe, well, it's not really a summit, or we don't feel like summit describes it. At a strategic level, when you're in the meetings and, you're obviously looking at all the numbers and thinking, well, maybe this particular event would benefit from having a little bit more of a trade show type environment attached to it or not, right? How do you work through the strategies and the numbers for that?
Yeah, I think to your point, some of it is branding and marketing and, what sounds the best and how to, have that event name or program resonate with the audience. But I think it really comes down to the needs of that particular industry. And in terms of in an expo floor, what exactly is it that they're exhibiting and how much of that is the value that's brought to the event versus, the agenda and the content itself. And in terms of the competition and how to manage the flow of traffic, it does get a little bit complicated because you have different ticket types and there's exhibitor only passes. They're not allowed to leave the floor.
Right.
Certain passes only allow you to get into certain sessions or tracks. And, it could get a little convoluted and understanding why is really a great question. So when you're in the strategy meeting, I think it's all about the value proposition and thinking about the end user and the audience. So as you bring together this community, put yourself in the perspective of each of the different types of attendee in that community and what it is that they're looking for and what their needs are. And that's what's going to define the style of the event. And that's, in my opinion, the most important aspect is when you look at it, the value driver between why is someone going to attend this event? What matters to them most? And then if you define that, that's where it's going to really help clarify what's the type of event that this is going to be and what structure should it be. I mean, you can call it a summit, you can call it a conference, but I think the biggest question is like, should there be an expo floor with actual booths where you're just selling real estate and then it's up to them to build it out and have them, engage and transact with the audience there? Or is it something more of, folks are here to learn, they're here to network and make connections, in which case, building some more experiential aspects to the event, like, receptions, happy hours, offsite things that, I think really help in terms of for the individual, what's that experience going to be like? So when you're going through the numbers, it's all a cost benefit analysis, right? And you want to think of that not just from your perspective as the event host, but from the buyers and the attendees' perspective. Why is it that they would want to invest here to be an exhibitor or a sponsor? And what is the message they're trying to get across? And so I think the more you could define those needs of the end users across the entire ecosystem, the better chance you have to prescribe the type of event it should be and what's the most pertinent or valuable format for that particular audience. And so I'm a big proponent of working backwards. What's the point? What's the value proposition? Why would someone be there? And then you work backwards to build out how that event should be structured to fit the needs of those different sets of individuals. So a lot of it is segmenting your audience and understanding, there's the agencies, there's the media buyer planners, there's the publishers, there's the tech providers, and how would they all cooperate or work together in this on-site experience, and then building that out so that it facilitates that type of engagement in a meaningful way. And in some cases, what you'll have is what you mentioned, where it's not truly an exhibit hall where you're given a blank piece of real estate and then they're building out some. In some cases, those are really powerful for those types of companies. In other cases, they just want a booth or an area where, hey, come meet us at this exchange area. And so people know where to find you. And they might only have one monitor or some swag on the desk. It's different than someone building out what could be several $100,000 expo, for their booth. To call it a booth is really an injustice, because some of the things you see on site at these events are amazing. It's extremely impressive, and you can tell the amount of investment that goes in. Different from what you can say is more of an exchange area where you just want a place where you could post up, find me at this spot. And
Yeah,
so
it's a table, basically. It starts at a
exactly
table and then it works.
starts at a table and it grows up to your building. It's a whole building inside of an expo room, which is It's just pretty amazing some of the stuff they do on the construction side. They'll put a meeting room on top, there'll be a cafe bar at the bottom, a whole living room, and then obviously all their products and everything else. So it's like they're building out an entire, office, if you will, in one little square versus, hey, find us at this table where you can meet with the rep or meet with the team. And so, but the managing the traffic, being able to build an agenda that allows for the flow of individuals to get a little bit of everything, I think that's also part of the art, is understanding exactly how much time do you need in between sessions, how many networking breaks, the location of those table exchange areas versus where the content happens. If there's noise that'll spill over, do we have to ask people to be quiet? Like, not really. You don't want that to happen. So it's about managing the real estate and the time slots and understanding how to best uh, build something in concert. You want the agenda to be in concert with each other so that the exhibitors don't feel left out from what's happening on stage, or they feel like we're not getting as much foot traffic because they're in this other part of the conference. You want everyone to have their time and place to achieve what they're there to accomplish. So that a lot of times it's really the agenda management and managing the flow of traffic in terms of foot traffic.
Yeah, on the foot traffic side, it reminds me of sort of the best practice in supermarket design is to put the milk and eggs diagonally across from the entrance, right? So that the person has to go
Has to
as
go
far as
across and buy
possible to
something
get
else
there,
on the
right?
way.
And they
Yeah,
do it at the conference with the lunch, right? To get to the
exactly.
lunch or to the alcohol, you need to, weave
You
your
need to
way
see all the
through.
sponsors and exhibitors first before you get to the bar at the happy hour. It's true. It's true. And a lot of times, depending on the venue or the style of the event, it is a challenge. There could be operating in separate buildings or separate levels. So after one session, you see a room clear out, they have to get to the stairs or to and so you have folks sitting there with traffic signs and arrows pointing which way for this track versus that track. And so that is part of the challenge logistically as well, to understand the footprint of the venue and where certain parts of the event would take place and how it makes sense. Because again, you want it to all work in concert with one another, and you don't want there to be friction or overlap where it causes disruption or challenge. And so understanding the venue, what that venue is really willing to offer, and then making sure your agenda and event setup matches what they're actually able to deliver. Otherwise, you can be left in a situation where there could be one track that's totally empty, one room that's empty, and a sponsor is on stage wondering where everyone is, and that could be, based on the floor plan or the flow of the event, as well as who they're competing with, how many different sessions are happening at that particular time. So when you want to have the cooperative effort between the event planners and folks building the program and agenda, as well as who's selling the sponsors and exhibitors and the venue itself, because it has to look and feel a certain way where there's good flow and there's not too much dead time. Like, you want there to be, you understand people's time is valuable, it's an investment, so you want them to maximize the value and of their time spent on site. And a lot of that has to do with how well you're able to plan the agenda, the sponsor and exhibitor setup, and where all your different experiences are happening at the event itself.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot more moving pieces than most people think about. I'm sure that when you attend events, having been in the business now, you like notice things much differently than you might have, before having gotten into the event business. So I'd love to, and you may also be active in sort of doing the due diligence during M&A when you guys are thinking of acquiring something. So are there certain things that you see which are like red flags that are sort of opportunities for improvement over and over again, where you're like, oh, well, if I was running this, I would do bing, bing, bing. Like, if there's certain common themes where there's sort of mistakes that people are making that you've seen over and over again and said, up there it is again, the same problem.
Yeah, I think room utilization is a key KPI that we keep a good focus on, because it all comes down to what we were mentioning earlier around the commitments and what are the needs of that event, and then ultimately filling the space. And so if you're at an event and you notice that there's unused space or opportunity to monetize that's being wasted,
Mhm.
that is sort of the low hanging fruit, if you will. And a lot of that has to do with managing the commitments, understanding different venues, and having the creativity of knowing what you can do in different spaces that would be engaging and how to do things differently. Because, I don't want to say all the events are the same because that's doing it an injustice. And so ultimately, yeah, how can you do things differently so that folks leave there being like, wow, I haven't seen that before, or you know that whatever you paid for the venue and the add-ons there, those didn't go wasted. And it's a challenge because a lot of times it's difficult to determine how much space you'll need next year for an event that's still early in its life cycle. I think the in the due diligence side and M&A side, understanding the where the event or brand is in its life cycle. If it's in its early days and it's still in rapid growth mode, it's a lot harder to plan and foresee, what that event might do 3, 5 years out from them versus an event that's more mature, that's been around maybe decade plus. I think that the ability to plan for those is a lot easier to quantify your needs and understand limitations and their expectations. So I think, aside from the commitments and the space utilization and understanding different venues and where they can take place, it's understanding where that event is in its life cycle and the opportunity for growth. Is it limited based on the fact that it's a mature event? This is, where it's going to be in terms of size and scope versus earlier on where it's yet to be determined. And so, for us, we like to look at events that are a little earlier on because you see the opportunity for growth in the long term. So when you consider sort of the lifetime value of an investment, a property that's more mature, there's more limited upside than there would be for a brand or an event that's earlier on in its life cycle.
So, how should people think about that decision when they feel like they've probably outgrown their venue, right? But often there's like a jump that you need to make to a significantly bigger venue that has completely different vibe, right? I
Right.
mean, you think about Manhattan, where I happen to be today, right? I mean, there's a half dozen hotels that are pretty decent size from a venue space. And then like once you jump to the Javits Center, it's just a
It's the
completely different
perfect
feel.
example. It's the perfect example. And it's really around the city and whether or not that event owns a specific spot on the map or if it's something that could be relocated. Because, if it's a New York event, you hit the nail on the head. The options are limited, and each of the venues, they know that. So they have leverage, whether it's forcing them to use certain union workers or their partners. It's just there's fewer spots that can really fill the needs of those types of events. There's, in New York, you're looking at a handful of hotels that can probably fit several thousand, but there's a limit. And then to jump to the Javits Center, that's restrictive, because that's too much of a risk in the sense that unless you're sure that you can fill it out, you can lose on both sides there where you overcommitted space, your cost is going to be farther than, and you couldn't fill it. So the attendee or sponsor experience is underwhelming. And so I
Yeah,
think part of that has to do with the nature of the brand and whether or not that event owns a city or if it's more, this is when it takes place, but each year it could be in a different place. And, there's always as a show planner, there's a benefit to going to a destination city like a Las Vegas because there's so many options. So
mm,
you have flexibility, and those venues are forced to compete with one another because they know they're not the only game in town.
right.
And so that's the opposite of the New York effect. If I were to sort of compare the polar opposites, New York, you're forced to play within their limits, and you really have very few options or choices outside of that. But if you go into whether it's Las Vegas or even like Orlando, there's a lot of different opportunities, and you get better value in terms of your costs and your ability to be flexible in a specific space. But then you're hoping that your attendee base or your audience is willing to travel, because that becomes the question is, what is the demographic of the audience? Are they mostly traveling? Are they local? Are they international? And
Right.
so depending on how you answer those questions will force you to decide where this event should take place. And yeah, it would be a lot cheaper to do an event somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest or something, but who's really going to show up? And so I think the more you understand your audience and the more you understand the total addressable market and how much that particular audience or event might grow, that helps drive the decision making. And so, in terms of risk management, it's all about that, how much you're willing to invest and what are the requirements of that particular organization. Because if you're willing to operate at break even because you're looking to grow the event and you're focusing on this long-term bigger picture goal where everything just needs to be bigger, that's different from this event needs to churn out this margin, this level of profit. So it's dependent on what the needs are of that particular organization and how much they're willing to reinvest in the brand. And so, there's times where events are earlier on in their life cycle where profitability isn't necessarily the goal. It's about building the audience, building the brand, growing the event so that it has a better position in that market. And then the profitability will come down the road once it reaches a certain scale. And so I think a lot of it is driven by, I don't want to say ownership, but what are the expectations of that event, and whether that's the core driver of profits or if this is something that's ancillary. And what you mentioned earlier about some of the tech providers running their own events, like Dreamforce doesn't have to be profitable
Right.
for Salesforce. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So that's not a concern of theirs, and they're doing it to build their brand. And so it's really, what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish with the event? And then it helps sort of drive some of those decisions backwards. Because if you have an ownership model or a business model where they're not focused on earnings this year, or they're not looking to have an exit in the foreseeable future, they can focus on reinvesting, growing that brand, gaining market share and beating out competitors. And then they can turn the focus on the margins and profitability down the road. So it really is dependent on the nature of the organization, their financial position, and a lot of that has to do with liquidity, right? And how much is available to reinvest. And so I've worked with business leaders that profitability was not their goal. And then I've worked with others where we need to be profitable this month, and there's no way we can't be. So you have to find a way to make that happen. And so a lot of that sort of forces the hand one way or another.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's had to have been a bit of a ripple effect as a result of the increased cost of capital, right? Because back when, you could basically, borrow at nearly zero
0%.
interest
Yeah.
rate, right? If you were like, oh, let's just, borrow a little bit to invest this year, now you might be close to double digits in some cases,
Right.
depending on the risk profile of the business. So I think that must have an impact, and also from an M&A and private
I
equity
was about to say
perspective.
absolutely from the M&A side. And well, what you had was that period where rates were, I don't want to say artificially low, but where they were, there was excess liquidity, and access to capital was abundant. And so there was a lot of investment activity. And it was a beautiful time if you were in the market and you were looking to do those types of strategies, because there was just a lot more opportunity and a lot more ability to make those types of deals happen. I think what you're seeing now, the pendulum has swung a little in the sense that more of your budgets are now to service debt, right? And the cost of servicing debt that you committed to several years ago, it looks a lot different than it did then. And I don't know how many folks had modeled out that they expected interest rates to go up by 5% in a year and a half, but that came as a surprise, I think, to a lot of people. And it's not just cost of capital and how much of your budget is or how much of your cash flow is used to service debt. I think it's also your ability to operate the business in this new inflationary environment where everything costs more than it used to, and how much can you pass on to the client or customer in terms of, do you have to make changes to certain decisions so that it fits within this new budget landscape, or can you raise prices? And so in the margin and pricing game, not an exact science, and that's part of the challenge. And so, but yeah, from an ability to access capital and how much of your cash flow is used to service that debt, we've gone from what was probably the best time in history almost to more of a, the norm, I would say, because this certainly isn't the most expensive it's ever been. But I think in the amount of time that it changed, how rapid of a change and how quickly those rates accelerated, I think that is unprecedented.
Mhm.
So, it's a challenging time for everyone to operate with, because at this point, what does the next 2 to 3 years look like from an interest rate cycle perspective? And I don't think anyone really has an answer. And I know the Fed, they had their meeting last week, and they still foresee rate cuts, but that could change in just a short amount of time. And so even their forecasts and models are built on a lot of assumptions that could change in real time.
For sure. Well, I think it's been really useful for folks to sort of who may be the ones writing the checks as sponsors, as exhibitors, to understand the opposite side of the equation and sort of how you and your teams look at developing and deploying events. Do you feel like there's more creativity among the show producers now that when somebody shows up as a sponsor, you know, it can stuff be off prospectus? Like you get your check,
Yes,
like, these
great
are the
point.
12 things that you could do. Do you feel like as a result of being more nimble in the events business now, production teams are like, yeah, I'm open to considering something that maybe wasn't on my prospectus?
Absolutely. I think there's a few different reasons for that. One, we were talking about margins and pressures on pricing and how much can you really pass on. And so there's a lot more attention paid now to sponsor fulfillment. What are the deliverables and entitlements that sponsor gets? And, what's the appropriate price based on the revised cost footprint and what we're willing to
Right?
offer them? And
Yeah.
from a sales rep perspective, they don't necessarily care. They want to get the sponsor in, they want to get the best dollar they can, they want to move on to the next sale. From the event ops and logistics team perspective, they're the ones that are forced to try and operate within that, those
Right.
restrictions, those restraints. And so you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But to your point, the creativity, I think, that's where you unlock value, because sometimes the greatest experience don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. A lot of times it's just thinking differently and doing things differently. And the fact that there are so many events and a lot of them are very similar in nature, even if they're in different industries, like you have the happy hour sponsor, you have the title sponsor. It's just like it's very similar in what they're able to offer in terms of the value prop. So the more creative you can get, the more responsive or receptive potential sponsors will be, because they want to do things differently. And ROI is calculated in a lot of different ways. And depending on what their goals are, that can help drive some of the decision making in terms of what do we want to offer them and how much ultimately does it cost us. And for us, I think it's understanding the buckets of types of sponsors. So if your sponsor is a thought leader, what they're doing is they're looking to buy attention, right? They care about who's in the room, they want to deliver a message to an audience. And so what they're focused on is getting their message to the right people at the right time. And then there's sponsors who just want to build their brand, and there's branding sponsorship. So they just need, they want to own a particular place of real estate in the event, or they want to own something where people become familiar with their brand and they'll be able to amplify a brand that's in growth. And then there's the exhibitors that, there's product demos and there's connections that they're looking to make on the granular level. And so understanding what the goals are of the company that's considering a sponsorship or an exhibit helps drive a unique approach to what should we offer this person. When you said off prospectus, I think that's a great point, because the prospectus is limiting, and that's people don't always want what they had last year or what somebody else also has. They want something totally different. They want to be able to stand out and cut through the noise. And a
Right.
lot of times that's a collaborative effort between the show organizer and the sponsor and exhibitor itself. So how much information are you getting during that research and discovery phase about what is it this client is trying to accomplish? And then working internally with your team, what is something we can offer them that's out of the box, that is different, that has an aspect of creativity or experiential to it that you want people to remember it. And
Yeah.
a lot of times it's not, oh, they spent more, so they got the most value of it. Not necessarily. Sometimes there's like a little nugget of magic that's based on, an experiential aspect of it. At one of our events, we had a sponsor did like a drone light show, and it was basically they took over the skies with thousands of drones, and it was an amazing thing all on their dime. And we were the one to facilitate that as part of our event. And like, talk about a memorable experience. And none of that would have been possible if it wasn't for the collaboration between the sponsor and the show organizer. And what is it you want to do? How do you want it to look and feel? Let's make that work for you. So the more flexible the show organizer can be in getting that information, understanding what's driving the decisions of their client, and then building a program or sponsorship that fits those particular needs. And
Right.
so the prospectus is a great tool, because your sales reps, they're trying to get out to thousands of different prospects. They want to be, this is what we do, here's our demographics, here's how many people are at our event. But after that initial engagement and touch point, you want them to know that, well, we can do whatever you need. You just tell us what those needs are
Yeah, as
to
long as
put
the money
together.
is there.
Right. And we want to make sure it makes sense, not just for us
Yeah, sure.
as well, because that's part of the challenge is you want them to leave knowing that their investment was well worth it. They want to do it again next year and how it might look or feel differently next year because you don't want it to be stale either. It's like, no offense to the lanyard sponsors. I mean, those are great because everybody sees the lanyard. There's thousands of them all day. So like you don't want to take away from sort of the long-standing traditional sponsorships and
Mhm.
branding aspects that have existed. I think it's more about what could you do differently that cuts through the noise, that has more of a remnant, hey, did you see that at that event or did you hear about that? And it's really that level of engagement that happens after the event where you get some of the best value, if you can go viral, so to speak. But like, when people are talking about a particular aspect of event, that's those are the memories that you want to make. And that's where people will say, you know what, that's an event I need to be at or events I need to sponsor at. And, so the creativity aspect and the flexibility is key as a show organizer because whatever's on your prospectus, you got to be willing to put that aside. The media kit's great, but like in reality, if someone comes to you with a unique set of needs and they have a goal or they have a vision of what they're trying to do, you want to be able to accommodate that. And like you said, you want it to be in such a way that it's beneficial for all of the parties. You don't want it to be cost restrictive, in which case it's a one and done, and you're like, yeah, it was nice, but that'll never come back.
Right.
So you want something that has legs and could be long standing and could be, replicated across different events, different years and different sponsors.
Yeah, it sounds like the key really from the perspective of the show organizer is to have that collaborative relationship internally between sales and operations, right?
Yes.
Because you sometimes have an inherent tension because sales wants to sell anything that they can do just to raise the number that they get commissioned on. But
Mhm.
then if they're not in collaboration with the operations team, they may end up, promising something that's nearly impossible or super expensive to execute against. So it sounds like having that internal communication is super key.
Before you put a price tag on a proposal, before you present something for signature for a client, you want to make sure, one, that you can actually do it. You want to make sure you can deliver on those promises, and two, you want to make sure you don't break the bank on it. So I think there has to be that level of due diligence and the prerequisite work that goes in before presenting that to the client. And the amount of information you can gather from those initial meetings with your prospective client, I think the more information, the better. And then when you're putting together your bids and your proposals, that your team is involved and you know the full scope of how much it'll cost to deliver on these promises so that you're pricing it accordingly. And that, I think you look at it in two separate buckets. Is this a cost that would exist regardless of if we had it sponsored or not? Call it like the breakfast sponsor or the lunch sponsor. Like we're still going to have lunch. So whatever you get for the lunch sponsor is nice. But it's different from something that's more experiential or unique in that there's incremental costs related to the sponsor fulfillment that would not exist if the sponsor doesn't come in. And so a lot of that involves scoping it out on by the ops team and logistics team. They got to know how much each one of those deliverables will cost, and you want your sponsor margins to be at a certain level. So it almost backs you into what the number should be in terms of the price tag for the client. So that's critical because the worst thing you could do is overpromise. You give your sponsor exactly what they want, they love it, and the price is unbeatable, but you lost money on the deal and you didn't even know about it till after the fact.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that becomes part of the challenge, I think, is in the planning, understanding the different inputs and how that impacts the financial model of that particular sponsorship and then the event as a whole, and then being able to present that. Because again, it has to be mutual beneficial. Like the
Right.
cost benefit is a two-sided coin because whether from the client's perspective, are they getting the value and what they paid for and the right ROI? And for us as the show organizer, you don't want to lose money on it. You don't want to be
Right.
forced where you're gonna, you've overpromised and now you have to deliver the world and you're gonna take a loss on that. And that does happen. And in some cases, you're willing to let that happen if it's for the right sponsor. Right?
Yeah.
If it's for that key player that if they're not there, our event doesn't have the same gravitas. That's different, but that's a business decision. That's a strategic decision. And so the more of those types of discussions that are happening preemptively before presenting that to the client, I think that is where you make sure you're not caught with any surprises. And I think really whatever you're talking about in terms of show planning and sponsorships, whether you're on the event organizer side or on the client side, you want to eliminate or minimize surprises, and especially surprises to the downside,
Right.
and a lot of times, unless there is that prerequisite work going in where you have your different departments communicating with each other, you don't realize the impact until after the event is done and you're looking at the financials and you're like, why did we just spend so much on that particular thing? We only sold it for X. And that's where you lost, because that conversation has to happen first. And it's all part of the bigger picture strategy for the business. But yeah, it's tricky, especially for smaller groups and folks that have tighter budgets, because they want to get the right clients in. And it's hard not to get excited when the sales rep comes in and say, I got a big meeting with this client and we need them in, let's make it happen. And to your point about the push and pull, there does have to be those levels of checks and balances. Otherwise, you can end up taking a loss on it.
Right, right. Well, all really great stuff. Thanks so much, Danny, for sharing some insights into the event business. And that will allow sponsors to go in eyes open, potentially with a creative mindset. So that's super cool. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. This was a pleasure, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.